Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you all in our program, which is called Thames Speaks. Thames Speaks is a program where we choose different stories which are happening around the world and which impacts the people, those who live near Thames River. Especially, this is an important program because near the Thames we will see millions of those people, those who migrated from Afghanistan, and there are millions of those people, those who have experienced the soil of Afghanistan or the politics or geopolitics of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was a hot issue and Afghanistan is still a hot issue. We have discussed this issue with various people with different perspective. One of the prominent personality from British politics, Rory Stewart, has written an important piece. He also made a documentary about this few years ago, which is really relevant in terms of British context today. And Afghanistan is the land where maybe a lot of people remember in terms of the place where ancient grammarian Panini was there, and a lot of people they remember as a Gandhar civilization, and a lot of people remember in terms of Rudyard Kipling. I can say that's the stage for the greatest piece of great game in the Kim, which was written by Rudyard Kipling. In the same play, he has written one sentence which was quoted in recent article by our esteemed guest. The game is so large that one sees but a little at a time. So I would like to welcome our today's guest, who was students in Mayo College, who studied in Hampshire College in USA. He was also studied. He was also a student in SOS in London. He became MP from one of the biggest constituency in Rajasthan, Jaisalmer and Barmer. He became MLA. He is associated with Rajasthan Football Association as a president, and he is also having a completely different aspect of his personality. He is an amazing writer. He has written for various newspapers, channels, and he himself is a very good, an amazing defense analyst. Today I would like to welcome Manvinder Singh Jasol from Jodhpur. He is a great writer, especially recently he has published few articles about Afghanistan. Welcome, Manvinder Singh ji.
Thank you very much.
It's a really pleasure to see you here in this program. Especially, I still remember you have written one of your book, which was like election diary, and I still remember the first sentence, the moment when you switch off your Thar Jeep, which was I think which was traveled 500,000 kilometers in that 50 degrees Celsius heat temperature from Barmer and Jaisalmer. So this is an amazing journey which you have done in last 20 to 30 years, and I would like to welcome you here. And you have written recently a lot of articles, but I think everyone, especially in Western world, there is a concept about Afghanistan and there's a completely different concept about in Eastern world about Afghanistan. So today is a chance when we can match those different type of aspects and perspectives and concepts about Afghanistan. Maybe can you please just tell me a brief history of Afghanistan, how Eastern people or Indian people see the history of Afghanistan?
You see, you must remember one thing, and people tend to forget. Until 75 years ago, roughly, India and Afghanistan shared a boundary. Until the creation of Pakistan, India's border touched Afghanistan, and that border touched Afghanistan for centuries. For 2,000-3,000 years. I mean, it touched Afghanistan as long as human beings settled in a settled sense, not in a pastoral sense, not in a grazing sense alone. Of course, like Rajasthan, Afghanistan also has a large population of animal grazing herders, and we continue to with that tradition, and so does a fairly significant population of Afghanistan. So cultural similarities have developed over centuries, over millennia of interaction. And interaction has, in human history, anywhere in the world, interaction has always been through some kind of an economic exchange, some kind of a cultural exchange, some kind of a social exchange. And that has been one aspect of Afghanistan. which has endured with India over centuries, millennia, and despite the creation of a land space in between, which is a political land space, that interaction with Afghanistan will always remain. These interactions, remember this is Asia. This is not, this is not the Occident, where boundaries are so defined that they create new cultural spaces. Here, the cultural spaces have been determined, generations ago, and those cultural spaces will remain, as fluid as they were thousands of years ago. So that interaction is there today and it will always remain. And that's why Afghanistan is so important for India in a modern sense as it has been in an ancient sense.
I completely agree. I think if even if we think of Buddhism, or if we think in terms of Zoroastrian religion, or if we think of Sanskrit, we will find somewhere roots which definitely goes back to Afghanistan, and its connection with Iran and our present India. As you said earlier, boundaries were not well defined in that era, but the cultural fluidity was there. Culture was flowing from one part to other geographical part. In West, we have a myth that Afghanistan has never been conquered in the history, and recently you have written an article, and with the help of different examples from the history. That example may come from the Iranian culture, that example may come from European culture, or it may come from Indian aspect. Can you give me a few examples how this myth can be busted that Afghanistan has never been conquered?
Well, this myth this developed because of the interaction of the British largely, and then subsequently, what the Soviet invasion and now this current end of the U.S. operations. So, I mean, there are certain lines or some things which become permanent once they get repeated many times. Until 1744, roughly, when the modern state of Afghanistan was created, there was a lot of to and fro between various empires, various kings, various rulerships, and various governorates. Between Delhi and Kabul, Kandahar, somebody was ruling, somebody was governing, somebody was younger brother, somebody was elder brother, and that that fluidity, that connection remained for centuries. And on the other side on the western side of Afghanistan, Herat had a very close connection to ancient Persia, before it was became Iran. So, these are, and for example, in the north, Mazar-e Sharif had a, close connection with what is now Uzbekistan, and then, Samarkand, and Bukhara, and those ancient emirates. So these interactions, these control, or what you call control in a political sense, military sense, that has always been to and fro. Some empires come up, some empires go down. Rulers come up. Their kingship sustains, doesn't sustain. So that is one of the ebbs and flows of history. And to make a permanent settlement or permanent claim is based on no facts. It's based on something in the air which catches somebody's imagination and becomes permanent, which is never the case.
But I think maybe can you mention a few names, especially those names which are very close to your heart or maybe close to the clan, those who were part of as a maybe governor in the present Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, from a geographical sense, if I have to, my roots are in Western Rajasthan, and the first, Maharaja Jaswant Singh of Jodhpur was the governor of Kandahar. He actually died in Jamrud when it was still part of Afghanistan. Now, of course, because of what subsequently Maharaja Ranjit Singh of Lahore, his his rule and his incursion into what was Afghanistan, and his wresting away territory from Afghanistan, which stretches all the way from Peshawar, Khyber, southwards. All of this was Afghan territory. This is where the Amir used to send the younger brother to govern Peshawar, and the elder one was the Amir in Kabul. So that was put an end to by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So whatever I mean, I can irritate the Pakistanis by saying that they should thank Maharaja Ranjit Singh for their map, because if it hadn't been for Ranjit Singh's invasion of Afghanistan, the map of Pakistan would have been very different, because Peshawar today would have been part of Afghanistan, which is what it was for centuries. Um, and all these, what is Fatah, what was Fatah, I think it's part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. I mean, all of this was Afghanistan. So, yes, the last, of course, impact was Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And then this became British India and stayed after that.
Here, I would like
There
to
was
add one
nothing.
more thing. When you mentioned Maharaja Jaswant Singh from Marwar, when he was in, when he had his last breath in Jamrud, I remember from the family history, one of my ancestors was with Maharaja Jaswant Singh, so it has special connection with this particular
Yes.
part of the history.
Yeah.
There's one more myth, which, as I mentioned from in the beginning, in the Rudyard Kipling's words, that it's a graveyard of empires as well. Not only just the greatest game, it's also graveyard of empires, because as we discussed earlier, from interaction between Russians and Afghanistan, interaction between British and Afghanistan, and interaction between Americans and Afghanistan. That's the new theory which is taking shape now, that is the graveyard of empires. Is this really true, or if it is not, then why?
Well, if you look at it in a modern sense, I would say it's probably true, because people have gone to Afghanistan with a certain ambition of rulership and claims, and those have not been met, because they couldn't be sustained. And and in the modern story began, of course, with the first Afghan war, and and what preceded that was the disastrous um, uh, entry into Kabul by Alexander Burns and his party, and how they were slaughtered. They had to escape, and then how the British lost, East India Company actually lost their rule, their reign in Kabul. I mean, their presence in Kabul was culminated that way, and that's how the story starts about the modern sense of graveyard of empires. And then, of course, you call the Soviets as an empire, and the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union's collapse as a political entity is blamed to a large degree on its failures in Afghanistan, and the 10-year campaign of trying to, you know, bring Soviet rule into Afghanistan. That ended in disaster, and within 2 years, Soviet Union vanished from the map as a political entity. So, so that sustains. I mean, in a modern sense, yes, it sustains. The ancient ones, the rulers were for centuries, and probably longer than a lot of other rulers elsewhere in the world. So it's a bit far fetched to say that it's always been that case. But in a modern sense, yes, I would say it's probably true.
The third concept is, um, in the Cold War era and before that, there was a great negativity between the relationship of Russians and British people and Europe. So, because of that, the new term which was coined the Great Game. So, do you think that Afghanistan was or is the stage for the Great Game?
Well, the target of the great game was India. Don't forget that.
And I think,
The ambition of
yes, here I will interject, I'm sorry. Yes, I think this is the key point which I think a lot of people, and especially the Western media, misses the important point why it was a great game. Recently, Rory Stewart, when his documentary was very popular, he also mentioned about the great game, but I think everyone failed to address the reason why it was a great game.
Yeah, I mean the British, clubs and London, institutes of thinking coined the phrase "great game," and at the same time in Saint Petersburg, which is what their capital was, Saint Petersburg, it was the term was used. The term that was used was the tournament of shadows. In Russian, the great game is called the tournament of shadows, and which is really a better way of explaining it, because it was basically people chasing shadows, thinking that so and so is hiding behind that pillar there, and it has a leg up or has a step ahead of my country in the game, and the game was to have access and have control over India and its resources, its climate. I mean, it's basically the whole trade. It's basically about trade, controlling trade between East and West, and in order to get to India through Europe, I mean, how do you get through land? You have to use Afghanistan. What was Afghanistan then? So that's why, and the idea was to have a stop the incursions in Afghanistan, keep Afghanistan as a buffer between the two empires, the Russian Empire and the British Empire. And that's why the venue of the great game became Afghanistan, but the target was India. And today, of course, that doesn't exist anymore. So, but the venue remains the same. People play the game thinking that, control of Afghanistan has various other ramifications. And unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. People suffer.
Yes, I think India was as a gift of that particular game. But in modern sense, if we think that it doesn't fulfill that particular aspect, because now all these geographical or geopolitics in this particular South Asian country, it has completely changed. There's one more myth that because of in response to the Soviet incursion, or in response to the Soviets' dominancy in Afghanistan, Mujahideen forces were formed. So, do you really think that the Mujahideen forces were formed because in response to the Soviet invasion in 1979?
No, far from it. I mean, it's there is enough evidence, and there's enough. Material and other evidence, anecdotal evidence, to say that the actual creation of Mujahideen groups, to whatever degree, was well before the Soviet invasion, well before I think the Soviets even knew that they would be planning something like that. It's well before any of the so-called progressive parties of Afghanistan came to power. It was around the time when the king was still in power, King Zahir Shah, and it was initiated by the Pakistanis with money from the Saudis, and probably somebody else from the Gulf. But I know for a fact it was Saudi money and Pakistani initiative to create these groups so that harass Kabul from its friendship with India. That was it was as simple as that. It had nothing to do with the Russians. It had nothing to do with Soviets. It had nothing to do with any great game being played out between Cold War superpower rivals. It was basically simple harassment of Kabul because the Afghan state government had been friendly with India for centuries and remained friendly with India despite all the changes that had happened since 1947 between the two countries. And so in 1973, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, as Prime Minister, started a new cell in the Pakistan Foreign Office. It wasn't under the ISI. People say that the Pakistan Army started it. That's also a mistake. Pakistan Army had nothing to do with it. It was the Foreign Office in Pakistan where Zulfikar Ali Bhutto placed the cell. Of course, a retired officer from the Pakistan Army was involved, and but it was a Foreign Office initiative. It wasn't a Pakistan Army or ISI initiative, and that continued even later. And the same officer was involved in creating the Taliban, in the 90s after the Mujahideen, were slaughtering each other once the Soviets left. So the Mujahideen groups have nothing to do with the Soviet invasion. They were created before that, and it was a harassment move which succeeded to a large degree, because then the Soviets thought it was going to affect them, and they walked in, and then once they started walking in or planning to walk in, that's when the Americans got into the act and raised the stakes by raising the monies. And once the monies increased, then the attraction for more groups increased, and then after that the story is very clear or very murky, either way you look at it.
I think this is interesting to know that sometimes the world's perception is different, but the reality is different. Because the world thinks that Mujahideen forces formed after 1979 because of the Soviet invasion, but the real reason started in 1973 when Mr. Bhutto became Prime Minister and he opened a new desk in Foreign Office. So, and that's also in response to the India's friendship with Afghanistan. What is the reason behind the strong friendship between India and Afghanistan? What do you think? What was the reason that always Afghan governments were very close to the Indian governments and Indian people?
Well, because the interaction, I mean, if you look at it for centuries, the interaction has always been, amongst people, it's always been benign. It's not been any, it's not one of any stress being imposed on the other. Sure, there will be, invaders, but the invaders, earlier it was from the Indian side, and then later it was on the Afghan side. So that's, is squared in a real sense if you look at it in the sums. So, but that didn't change the affection between people because the interaction has always been of trade, of exchange. And once that exchange and trade is, without harassment, without stress, then that image and the affection remains. And that's what that's what has happened over the centuries, and continued after India became an independent country, because there are certain things that markets that India provided and certain markets that Afghanistan provided. The consumption of Indian culture, consumption of Afghan culture, goods, services remained as it was for centuries. And because that interaction had nothing to do with, harassing, fingering, raising these bogies about Mujahideen, so that's why the image sustained itself. I mean, when I went to Kabul some years ago, I actually really felt I was at home. I had never felt, I really thought, it could be part of any part of, my part of Rajasthan, the western part of Rajasthan. It reminded me of that. The air was red, it smelled the same to me. And it was as dusty as Rajasthan. I mean, it was, and noisy as Rajasthan. So I loved it. That's why I just felt so much at home.
Yes, I may completely agree with the sentence. It was dusty like Rajasthan because both has got similar texture of the land and soil, and temperature, heat, and scarcity of water. These are the common things which connects them together. When we were discussing all these ideas which has happened in the past, then there's one more last myth which has been propelled by a lot of Western media outlets and maybe a lot of media outlets from our neighborhood and different countries, that in the recent winner, Pakistan is a winner from a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. A lot of people, those who are in diplomatic field or those who are in different fields, they are raising their concerns that definitely Pakistan has got a special edge and now it will control Afghanistan. What do you think? Is it just a myth or there's some reality in it?
No, it's one of those instant, it's like an instant noodle, that you put some hot water and suddenly you have a bowl of noodles that you can eat, and people consume this this story because it came so instantly after as the government of Afghanistan fled, but that's far from it, and it was far from it earlier when the original Taliban ruled in the 1990s. Don't forget that Taliban, which was far more brutal and far more directly created by Pakistan. Even that Taliban didn't play ball with Pakistan in everything that they wanted. What does Islamabad want? Is basically that the Afghan government of any color, any belonging, agree to the Durand line as the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and no Afghan government of worth its salt has been willing to agree to that. The Taliban did not earlier, and the Taliban has not agreed to it today, and they won't agree to it in the long run. And that boundary remains a sore point for them because it basically makes them accept that the invasion and the division of Afghanistan And the separation of Peshawar and the adjoining areas from Afghanistan is a legitimate act. They cannot accept that. They won't accept it, and that's going to create friction in the long run. There is already a problem between Pakistan and Afghanistan. If it was also hunky dory, then why wouldn't Pakistan recognize the new government in Kabul? They haven't recognized. They're far from recognizing it. No, actually, nobody is recognized in the world. So that's it's nothing new. And then secondly, last 3-4 days ago, I don't know if it was in the Western media, but it was definitely over here that Pakistan International Airlines has suspended its flights to Kabul because of harassment from the Taliban government or the new government or whatever name it calls itself, because they're not able to sustain those flights because of harassment. Why would they be harassing Pakistan International Airlines if it wasn't if it was a friendly country or a country that's going to control them? Nobody is going to control Afghanistan, and there are no. I would say there is no energy in this world that can control Afghanistan, and thankfully so. Why should anybody control anybody else? So I think it's not. They're not a winner for sure, and they have bigger problems than most other countries will have with Afghanistan.
I think I completely agree with you. It's sometimes we jump to the conclusion immediately when we see, and suddenly someone will give us a thought and we will reach to the conclusion, and I think it's too early to predict. It's too early to say that who will be the real winner, or this situation will go on maybe next 100 years or 200 years or 300 years. I wish as an individual that this problem should be sorted out, because it's a question of lives and death of normal Afghani citizens. And my concern is about that generation who has not been to the school, the generation who has not enjoyed their full human life. So I think this discussion will continue. We will take a break. After the break, we will discuss about various ideas about Afghanistan, what will be the future of Afghanistan, and how it will impact different countries in the world, and how India should play a role in Afghanistan. So please join us back after the break. Till then, on Sky 711 MATV, Thames Speaks. Welcome back. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are watching our program Thames Speaks on Sky 711, and we were discussing an important issue, and that issue was about Afghanistan. Everyone knows Afghanistan is a center or maybe an epicenter of geopolitics on this planet. It has caused a lot of problems in Western world. It has caused problems in different parts of the world. It's not only just war. I think it has also caused problems in terms of human migration, human civilization. It has cost millions of lives. And I'm able to think that maybe millions of people, those who were affected, they were not able to live a simple or humble life, and which is a basic right of each and every human being on this planet. So we were discussing this issue with one of our esteemed guests, who is a politician, full-time politician, who is an amazing writer, and who is also working hard to revive football. So maybe I'm thinking maybe the Afghanistan issue also became like a football between different countries of the world. So that's why he is also playing an important role in this discussion today, because he is not only a good writer, he is also president of Rajasthan Football Association. So we will continue with our esteemed guest Manvinder Singh Jasol, who is with us. So we were having discussion about those 4-5-6 myths which Western media and Western people has built up around Afghanistan without knowing the full history and without checking all the facts which exist in the plate of history. Probably people didn't pay attention to those things. So my next question is, after Soviet invasion and other things, there was one famous government, and that was President Najibullah's government. Najibullah, you can see from the photograph, he's a very tall, handsome, and a person who was leading Afghanistan in the modern era. What has happened to the President Najibullah, and why his government maybe I can I can put it this way, why his government achieved that type of fate which we were not expecting in those days.
Well, when I was in Kabul last, 10 years ago, and the main, I was told that is the main shopping street. It's called Chicken Street. And I would think about almost half the shops in Chicken Street, on Chicken Street, had stickers, those stickers on the windows that you put up of somebody or, whatever. Like I put up football stickers. So they had stickers. Almost half the shops had stickers of President Najibullah, late President Najibullah, and late Ahmad Shah Massoud together. One sticker, side by side. No, I mean, not that Ahmad Shah Massoud and President Najibullah liked each other. They were daggers drawn, mostly. Um, I think they were contemporaries in some educational institution. I'm not sure if it's correct or not, but that's what I read somewhere. But that was what the people, the shopkeepers, who identified the most in terms of modern Afghan icons. For them, these two ideas that these two represented, the philosophies that these two represented, the aspirations that these two represented, most of the shopkeepers subscribe to those ideas, thoughts, aspirations, philosophies. And I thought that was very striking. And I asked some of them, the shopkeepers whom I could communicate with, and they were very proud of those stickers. They believed them. They kept that loyalty intact. And the sad thing about the Najibullah government, the brief Najibullah government, but one thing it was that nobody expected to survive a day. It didn't. That was the expectation. There was the thinking that the moment the last Soviet soldier has walked across the bridge on the Oxus, the government of Najibullah is going to collapse. It didn't, and it sustained itself. It took on the fighting Mujahideen. It took on all the Mujahideen attacks, the brutality of the Mujahideen. It sustained itself. It kept the army intact. It kept governing. Kept the Mujahideen at bay. But unfortunately, two things happened, one after the other, and then everything just dried up. And the collapse of the Soviet Union made a difference, obviously, because for them it was a main, supporting base, supporting system, whether military, in terms of food grains, so many other things that their source for so many things. So it was just disintegrating. That was the big problem. And then secondly, friendly countries like India, which should have remained, loyal to the Najibullah government, should have sustained the Najibullah government to the best of the abilities. India also pulled back. India had a crisis that it was overcoming at that time. But I still think, these things are bigger than a temporary crisis. I think sustaining a government in Afghanistan is far more important um, than some local hiccups to do with administration. And India should have remained committed, should have kept the supply lines functioning, and because it did not, the government unfortunately collapsed, and some deals were brokered, and then President Najibullah cheated out of those deals to add to the tragedy. By which time, things had gone too far, and it was beyond. I don't think India had the capability anymore then to help where it should have. And I think the world owes it to Afghanistan also to have not turned a blind eye at that time. They left it thinking that it's a local problem and leave it at that. But these things are never local problems, as it came back to haunt the world later. And that's what I always believe, that You know, it's not that Afghanistan causes a problem to the world. The world has caused a problem to Afghanistan, and the world owes it to Afghanistan to help it in today and in the future. You can't walk away from Afghanistan thinking that it's not my problem. It is everybody's problem because everybody has created it. It's not a, it's not created by the Afghans, by themselves. Of course, the Afghan warlords, the Mujahideen commanders, they have, added fuel to the fire, and they've lit the match. I'm not taking that away. But the fact is that those matches and the fuel were supplied by people, by governments, by you know thinking that they remote control. So that's why I think the world is responsible and should remain responsible.
I completely agree with you. I think, sorry, I completely agree with you because people has, or maybe many countries in the world, they have created those problems, and finally they have to face action to reaction. So when there was action, people has faced that reaction in the world, and people did, maybe the countries, they didn't act promptly, and it has caused a bigger problems, and still we are facing. If we would have acted in a different way in that era, maybe these problems would not have occurred later. My next question will be, inaction in Afghanistan is the surest recipe for strategic irrelevance. This is what you have written somewhere. So is this true in terms of India as well, that inaction of India in Afghanistan is also a recipe for the surest irrelevance? So do you think that any country, those who were relevant for Afghanistan, later on if they will not do any action, they will become irrelevant? Why do you think it's so?
No, I wrote that specifically for India
Yeah.
because India as a neighbor has been a neighbor of Afghanistan for centuries, and like I said, the world can't walk away. India specifically cannot walk away. India has to remain engaged in Afghanistan, with the Afghan people. No matter what government comes to power in Afghanistan, I mean, no Indian can think that I'm not involved. It's not my business, or it's not my problem. That's that's what makes India irrelevant then, and that's why India is largely out of the picture now in terms of the decision making about Afghanistan, with Afghanistan, on Afghanistan. You can do your seminars as they're planning something in November with inviting various national security advisors on Afghanistan from various countries, including Pakistan and I think Central Asian republics. But the fact is that you're not engaging with Afghanistan. You're not engaging with the people, and it's not going to get India anywhere. You have to remain engaged on the ground in various ways, and unless you remain engaged, who's going to listen to you? Why should they listen to you?
Maybe we will continue with this part, that how India can engage in future and what will be the way ahead. But before that, I also want to know, how do you see what was Taliban, what is Taliban? Is there any difference in the old Taliban and the new Taliban? Can you please elaborate on that?
I never believed what people say earlier that good Taliban, bad Taliban, moderate Taliban, extreme Taliban. And I think when your roots are what they are, good, bad, moderate, whatever you want to call it, Taliban light, Taliban heavy, Taliban strong, dark, whatever you want to call it. The fact that the roots remain what they are. So when the roots remain what they are, ultimately the branches and the trunk will pop up to be what it is, and it's the same, the same flag, same white flag which they claim to be their, uh, you know, um, token of identity. They don't accept the Afghan national flag, which has been flying for about 100 years now. And, so I don't believe, and I also don't believe, what they claim, the Taliban or the current Taliban claims, that, these attacks at the various mosques in, say, Kunduz or Kandahar or on the Shia mosques are the creation of all the actions of Daesh, Khorasan. I don't believe that. I think these are basically outsourced entities of the Taliban. So the Taliban, has the current Taliban, the new incarnation of Taliban, has outsourced these activities to other entities so that they can show a distance, but the target remains the same as it was when they were governing last, and they can claim to be goody goodies to the people or to the world at large, and but they don't take action because they believe in the same things that the Daesh Khorasan is doing, and after all they've sourced them, they've encouraged them to do this. I mean they are basically subsidiary fronts. Um, it's like some big corporate house having various ancillaries, various subsidiaries.
And sister
I
companies.
think yeah,
Yeah.
offshoots. I
Yes.
think I think Daesh Khorasan is just an offshoot of the current Taliban, and it's a myth. I think they're just faking it. That is a different organization, and they are responsible for all the actions that have been claimed by the Daesh Khorasan.
Even there were news that the Taliban, which was engaged in talks and which has basically brought all these different conventions, conferences, and talks about power sharing, that faction is different than a hardcore faction which is ruling at the moment in Taliban, and then there are different factions within the Taliban, and they are fighting with each other for power, and there's a competition in between all those different factions as well. Do you think it's true, or they are just a simple structure and following the pre-written or maybe in a written script?
No, no, I do believe, and I've written it earlier, I don't believe that the Taliban is a monolithic organization, not by any such imagination. It is, it has a core, it has a central, committee or whatever you want to call it, a central grouping that runs the show. And, there are people who join, people who leave, depending on their interests, their personal interests. But all those who join, um, they do subscribe to that, that funny-looking white flag. Uh, they subscribe to the ideals, or they claim to subscribe to the ideals that are set out by this core group of pretty nasty people. And but then some people fall out because they came for some other deals and the deals didn't fructify. Whether it is a drug deal or whether it is a power broking deal in a certain district or a certain province, sometimes they don't work. So that person with his hired mercenaries groups, that person leaves with his group. Um, Suddenly says that he's become anti-Taliban, but they are joined for some other reasons. It's not always, you know, it's not always the purity of the ideology that has attracted them. There are other vested interests, and sometimes those interests are not served. And so, when you see that it's not getting served, you walk away, which is what some people do. And so that's why it's not a monolithic organization. Certainly not. Um, but it's largely, you know, it's largely controlled by a certain group of people.
Yes.
And that's what
There
all
are
these
different.
groups are anyway.
Yeah, there are different ethnic background people, those who are in Afghanistan, not only Pashtuns, there are Tajiks, there are Hajaras, there are Uzbeks. And the first line of resistance came from Panjshir, from Ahmad Shah Massoud's place and Amrullah Saleh. They registered for a few days, and later on, with the help of different various forces, they claimed that they won Panjshir. Do you think there can be more infighting within Taliban if deals which are happening because of their personal reasons or maybe personal gains or because of different type of finance and dominance over a certain region? Do you think these things can increase in future?
No, they certainly can increase. But increase or decrease will depend on how much pressure there is put on the Taliban by the world community. And suppose I mean hypothetically, suppose the world doesn't, you know, um, pay or doesn't let the Taliban government take loans or borrow money to run its government. But on the other side, the world pays or finds a mechanism to pay the Afghan health services, those very brave doctors and nurses who go out to work. Suppose the world finds a mechanism to pay them directly and not through their government. Um, that will increase pressure on the Taliban because it makes them really irrelevant. I mean, they can't control somebody's paychecks, and so where do the wield power on these doctors and nurses? So similarly, the other departments which the world should look at in terms of adopting, uh, you know, departments which are of daily public, use, say health, education, um, power, electricity. These are things which affect daily lives. Uh, Something which has to do with economic activity also. But these are the basics. You look after these, and economic activity can sustain or grow. But I think I think this experiment should be done for the sake of the Afghan people, and it's worth putting brains together to figure out a way of doing it.
I think creating
Once that is done,
employment for local people will be the biggest relief, because I see in Europe there are millions of Afghani people, those who are here, they are very hard working, they do different kind of businesses, but they work from morning till late nights and they keep their culture intact, and they also take pride in their own work, whichever work they are associated with. Now, you have written in one of your article, which I will just quote once,
I just stop you
maybe.
for a minute. Just stop you for a minute. Now that you reminded me, I was in a London cab many years ago, and the cab driver was an Afghan, and he was very happy that I was wearing Rajasthani clothes in London, and and he told me, he says, आपका लिबास बहुत अच्छा है.
That's great.
And,
I think whenever we will also have any cab driver from Afghanistan, or even people, those especially big car repairing garages owned by Afghanis, when you will go there, they will continuously talk to you. Maybe they can talk to you for hours. So, and they really feel good when they come to know who you are from where you are. These two things connects them strongly. But in one of your article you have written two sentences which I want to read out. The speed with which the Taliban retook power across the country is a testament to their simple logistical arrangements in the countryside and the conspicuous inefficiency of an Asian army designed around Western paradigms. The Afghan National Army simply couldn't become American. What do you think? It was all of a sudden. No one was expecting that this, as you said earlier, even Najibullah government, it fought against the Mujahideens. But in this present scenario, when there was more money was involved, there was more training was involved, more powerful forces were involved, and a lot of things were involved, still the Afghan National Army couldn't resist the movement or maybe the advancement of Taliban forces. What do you think? Why does this happen? What was, because you were also part of Indian Territorial Army, and you are also involved with a lot of things. So what do you think? What was the biggest mistake which they made?
you go back to February 2020, and you go to that document which is signed between the government of the US, Donald Trump's government, and the Emirate, which they call the Emirate. The Trump government signed an agreement with the Taliban, um, which paved the way, which started which sent a message to the Afghans that this system is over. Then the problem started in terms of administration. The troops were not getting paid. The troops fought brilliantly. The sacrifices made by the Afghan National Army over the years have been tremendous. Sure, they've had their problems because it's not it's not an efficient structure. But the problem is the structure was made according to American lines, And when what I mentioned was this was an this is Asian land, which it should be run by Asian principles. And you look at the diversity of Afghanistan, look at the diversity of India. It's the same. The Indian Army represents or has soldiers from literally every tehsil of India, every language possible in India, every religion possible in the world, uh, not just India, in the world. There are soldiers who are probably pagan, animist, Christian, Zoroastrian, every faith that you can think of. They serve in the Indian Army. They serve together. Because the army, the structure of the Indian Army is what I meant was an Asian structure in terms of a village cohesiveness. And that's how the Afghan army should have been made, not into these little squads of, replicating an American assault team. It should have been this Asian,
Model based on different, which represents the
Asian way
true
of living
diversity
together,
of
working
India.
together.
Yeah,
Yeah, working together, living together, rather than these compartments which they created.
I agree
And
with
when
you.
that cohesion would have sustained the army much longer.
We have very
And of
limited
course,
time, but can you just quickly tell us what is the way ahead? Just 2 bullet points. What is the way ahead for India and for Afghanistan relationship?
for India, it is the same as what it is for the world. Remain engaged with Afghanistan, remain engaged with the people, even if you don't like the rulers, remain engaged with the people because the world owes it to Afghanistan and the people.
Great. I'm really thankful to you, Manvinder Singh ji, for this insightful conversation. We can have this conversation maybe in the future, probably when we will do a separate session about what will be the way forward for Afghan and Afghani people. But I'm really thankful to you from MATV and from all our audience. And we will see you soon in future. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone those who are watching us on Sky 711.
Thank you.